Hello there, once again it's Hugh here, welcoming you to episode 6 of the Friendly Podcast, a project made possible by the support of Ireland Yearly Meeting. Throughout this series I'm sharing a range of interviews with folks from both home and abroad to hear what makes us friends today. First up this time is Gillian Armstrong, who attends Rathfarnham Meeting in South Dublin.
I applied for membership about 50 years ago. And I joined Rathfarnham Meeting. Rathfarnham was the first meeting that I went to in Ireland. I had a brief encounter with friends while I was a student in London because I lived in a girls' hostel, which was at the back of friend's house on the Euston Road. And from my bedroom window on the top floor, I could see friends going in to meeting on a Sunday morning. And I decided one morning that I would go. And I did. But the morning that I picked was the morning of where the huge commemoration is done of all the people who died in the wars. I think they call it, is that Armistice Sunday? Anyway, it's when the poppies are worn and they all go to the cenotaph. And I was in the meeting sitting near the back, and a rather disturbed man came in. And he was rather ranting and walked up through the meeting, and he didn't like the fact that friends hadn't fought in the war, and he was in to say his piece, and he walked up and down, and I presume an elder went up to him and after a little while gently shepherded him out, and I suppose spent time with him outside. So that was my first experience. I think that it would be right to say that I was initially drawn to friends because of the peace testimony. I was brought up a Presbyterian in Dublin, mostly in Dunleary, and sort of drifted away, particularly when I went away to London to study. And that was the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the very early 1960s. And there was a lot of activity by CND. And I joined CND and I had my badge and I went on demonstrations. And it was a scary time. And the threat of nuclear weapons was very real. And I was very happy to find that there was a church, a spiritual home where peace was really important and was actually a testimony. And that was, I think, the start of my motivation. But I felt very at home in Meeting for Worship from the beginning. And people were very kind to me. And I was really just happy and found it was a type of worship that I really could be comfortably involved in. And so I stayed and I applied for membership.
You're saying you arrived at Rathfarnham Meeting 50 years ago. What was Dublin like in the 70s? I guess with the backdrop of the Troubles, it must have been quite difficult to see that happening from afar.
It was. And because my husband is from Northern Ireland, we were really quite closely involved in the traumas that people were going through. And one member of my husband's family had a very close escape. He was shot at and severely wounded and recovered. But it was, you were so conscious of it, especially if you drove a Southern Irish car, you were very likely to be followed by a RUC car and stopped and asked where you were going and what you were doing. And one knew not to go into, there were lots of areas you just didn't go to, and there were lots of things you didn't say unless you were quite sure who you were saying them to. And my husband's family would have been from the Unionist side, but I suppose my views would have been more of those of a Southerner. So I had to learn to be careful what I said. I didn't want to upset any of his family, obviously. But the times like when internment was introduced, and before that, when I think that was before that, when there was talk of moving the Irish Army up to the border and waiting there in readiness, that was very scary. You could see that all of a sudden something like the Civil War could have so easily tipped forward into that at the time. So it was a scary time.
Were you conscious of what friends were doing at the time?
I would say it was a bit later that I became fully aware of what my focus was at that time would have been really with friends in Dublin, and knowledge of Northern Ireland was developing all the time. And then I did start meeting friends from the north. I mean, obviously from the time I would have first gone to yearly meeting, I would have met northern friends. And we started to hear more about the behind the scenes work of friends in Northern Ireland and the facilitating of, if you like, secret negotiations, or the sheltering of people who were fleeing from situations where they were in danger, and then on into things like Quaker Cottage and the work at the McGabry prison. I didn't personally know some of the prominent friends who were involved in those things at that time. I'd say that time was more or less past by the time I got to know a number of Northern Irish friends well.
So can I ask again, in terms of your relationship with Rathfarnham, so you're saying you arrived there 50 years ago. Am I right in saying that Rathfarnham Meeting celebrated 60 years relatively recently?
Yes. No, you put me on the spot, but yes, we have celebrated 60 years.
So you arrived when it was a fairly new meeting house, is that right?
Yes, that's right. I did.
So what was that experience like in terms of arriving at a place that was still only finding its feet?
I don't think I was aware of that. I mean, the friends who moved up to Rathfarnham, mostly from Churchtown, were very long established friends. You know, there was Bevan and Marjorie Lamb, there was Maureen McCaw and her husband George, and then Winnie and Brian Murdoch moved, and there were people like Douglas Harrison and his sister Audrey Howard, and we now have their descendants, of course, Alan and David Harrison, Valerie Howard, all of Winnie's two sisters, of course, Rachel and Heather, very important people. Winnie's daughter Fiona. Winnie's other family members are in England, but there was a strong nucleus, and Bevan and Marjorie in particular, the Lambs, they lived on the same road where the meeting house is, on Cranagh Road, as in fact do the McCaws and Winnie and Brian when he was still with us. And Bevan and Marjorie would absolutely, really, I think, every week invite somebody home to their house for coffee. And they were like good shepherds, you know. They took a newcomer under their wing. And I was probably a bit shy, you know. I didn't quite know what to make of this friendliness. And not long after I started going regularly, anyway, I had my first child. So there was a little bit of a hit and miss then for a while. We lived, at that stage, I lived very close to the meeting house, just round in Butterfield. And I would have tried to go every Sunday, and then we moved out to Lucan, so it was a bit more, on and off.
Are you conscious over the years just how much, if at all, the Dublin community of friends has changed?
Well, certainly I can remember back to when the whole of that premises on Eustace Street was owned by and used by friends. I can remember going to a meeting in what was called the big meeting room, and monthly meeting was held in the small meeting room, and I was at that on several occasions. That is just more or less preserved as one of the small cinemas with the windy staircase going up to it. And I think I did a brief stint as assistant to the clerk of monthly meeting fairly early on in my membership. And it was actually quite difficult. The table was down right on the floor at the foot of where the screen would be now. And the tiering was all the same as it is now. So if you would be, trying to help with a minute, and yet to keep an eye on who wanted to speak, your head was right down, and you couldn't see the people who were perhaps indicating that they were ready to say something. Then I can remember very clearly what it was like at Bloomfield, and the separate sections. I knew a couple of people, old people, who lived in the old residential section, which was a big house. I used to visit a lady there who was a musician. And then that was for people who were well, able-bodied, but needed to live in sort of sheltered accommodation. And then there were a section for nursing people who were not extremely ill, and then another section for nursing people who really needed very, very intense care. And the Swanbrook is one of the words I'm looking for. Swanbrook was the house where the office was, and when that happened there, the office moved from Eustace Street and was in Swanbrook, and we had a monthly meeting in Swanbrook. And then there was a huge discussion because of the big offer of money for the Bloomfield site and the offer of relocation up to Stocking Lane. And I can remember very intense meetings when all of the society were called together, not just Dublin Monthly Meeting, but the whole of the island called together and trying to discern what was the right thing to do. Should we take up this big challenge of moving up to the top of a hill, as it were, overlooking the city and building the hospital there, and the wonderful vision of a modern hospital that would be able to practice medicine at the highest level, as it has turned out to be, and able to specialise in particular illnesses and so forth. And the building of the present Quaker House building. And yes, there were a lot of changes within the 50 years that I've been around. I've been really in three different places between Eustace Street and Donnybrook and Stocking Lane. Yes.
So really, I know you had said earlier that you were a bit floored by that question. What significant changes have you seen that the yearly meeting has gone through? But in some ways, you've already kind of answered that question in the sense that, that they were, by the sounds of it, and I can only speak from somebody looking in on this, because I wasn't around really, or had any sort of awareness or appreciation for how significant those decisions were. But by the sounds of it, they were significant decisions to make, to downsize. Yes. Or to relocate.
Yeah, I think that the decision to sell part of the Eustace Street premises must that decision was really over the top of my head. I wasn't aware that that was going on, but it must have been quite dramatic for some people, because it was very much, really an old-fashioned meeting house. The meeting rooms had a real sense of history about them, and friends were centred at Donnybrook for a long time as well. It had become very much home, and then there was the wrench of the change and all the changes that happened in moving around. And it was legally, I think, I don't know how complicated it was legally to sell part of the Eustace Street premises, but it certainly was complicated legally regarding the stocking lane, setting up of stocking lane.
But it is fair to say that you find that the community amongst Dublin friends is quite strong?
Yes. I think that the feeling of community really through the island is strong. Some of the things I've been involved with. I went up as far as I did my 2 years as assistant clerk for a yearly meeting. I was also clerk of yearly meeting M&O for 3 years, and it's really essential and a very welcome part of that you get to know friends from all over the island. So I would definitely know a number of Cork friends, also from Limerick, Waterford, and a number of the northern meetings. And that's there is a sense of community right through the island. There's a common feeling amongst friends. I suppose it's this feeling that we recognise that we're all on a spiritual path together, and all at different places on the path, and there are those ahead of you that you look up to, and those who are newer, and you feel that you could maybe put in the odd word of encouragement or empathize with them in where they find themselves at a particular time. That, I think, is one of the huge strengths, and that is very much friends in operation. I think this caring for their own community, and so that goes really over the whole of the country. I got a lot. I noticed one of your questions was about whether it'd been abroad, and what did I know about friends from other countries. One of the great experiences I had was going to the Triennial when it was at King's Hospital in 2007, and I just took a decision. This is something I really want to experience. I want to meet friends from all over the world, and so I volunteered to be quite heavily involved, and in the running of the thing, and that was fantastic. And I've never travelled abroad, never been to Britain yearly meeting or anywhere else, but it was such a chance that everybody came from all those countries to be here in Ireland, and particularly the African friends. They were fantastic people, really fantastic people.
Before I let you go, I must ask, and you touched on it there, having been involved with committees and clerking, is there anything that you appreciate or love, that might be a strong word, but I certainly appreciate about the business method that we have in the yearly meeting?
I certainly think that they're one of our great strengths. And I've noticed that newcomers, if they if they start to get a feeling for how it works, they're very impressed, because we're able to conduct a meeting in a very kind of tolerant kind of way. And the way we make sure that each person speaks and then maybe doesn't speak again unless they need to. I mean, if it's a discussion between two friends, or, say the convener of premises is involved, well, I mean, that person will have to keep responding. But if it's more a general discussion about something, this waiting and listening and allowing the time in between, and the all important minutes. And that is such a fantastic thing, that the minute is agreed at the time, and if anything wants to be changed about it, it can come up again at the next meeting. But it will always be clear that the minute from the meeting before can't be changed. It's that was the decision at the time, but the people who were there, it was read out and it was agreed. And that is so different from the way business operates, where you can get the secretary perhaps just putting their own slant on what happened when they write the minute. And, I've seen a lot of that in different other organizations that you get involved in. And also the sort of the prayerfulness and the feeling that this is in fact a meeting for worship, and we are being enabled by the Spirit to really strive together to see if we can reach the right decision. The trouble is, and it also leads to sort of long discussions as to whether we will have a coffee after meeting every Sunday, or just on the first Sunday, or we can have incredibly long discussions about minor things like that. If we're kind of starting to draw to a close, I feel I'd like to just say regarding something very important. I think that one of the most important things that's happened in the last few years is the fact that we took a very difficult topic. First of all, with the civil partnership situation, and whether civil partnerships would be recognised and would be celebrated in some way, and then the more difficult situation of same-gender marriage. And I know that has made something of a division. But I think the fact that friends in Dublin feel that they can offer a marriage to a same gender couple, I think that's really, really important. It ties in with our equality, and which is, of course, is one of our testimonies, and it ties in with integrity and recognizing that of God in each person. There's so much involved in that, and I know that it was for some friends an extremely painful time when all that was being dealt with. And I think that society is in step with current thinking in the Republic, as you can see from the referendum results. And it has affected the whole society, because there are those who are not happy with it. But it was, I suppose, an amazing step that it was recognised that it was needed, that it had to happen for the people who are of the same gender and who had in many cases been together for years, and it was right. So that I think is a very important development for Friends. What about everything to do with climate change and the environment, and are we doing enough? And I was one of the people who started EcoQuakers after I'd been at the Triennial, and where lots of the meetings from overseas had sent statements on what they were starting to think about climate change and sustainability, and so EcoQuakers came into existence, and EcoQuakers got involved in the ecumenical group called Eco-Congregation. And I mean, it's now with the latest IPCC report, you just got this awful feeling of, what we told you so 20 years ago. This is around for so long, and I think it is something that Friends could have taken more of a lead on. It was quite difficult to persuade Friends, because I did quite a bit of going around to different meetings and talking about what EcoQuakers wanted to campaign about, and why was this important to Friends. But it has to be, because care for God's creation is it's absolutely should be a duty, but to get it across that it's a spiritual matter, not just a matter of recycling your paper and your glass. It's been interesting, but I would like more to have been done about that. Maybe it will now, because everybody's pretty scared at the moment. But I mean, that the IPCC reports and the COP meetings. I remember Eco-Congregation organised a big service in St. Teresa's in Clarendon Street to pray for a good outcome from the Paris COP. Now, I can't remember how long ago that was, but it must be 5 or 6 years ago.
I'm going to say 2015, I think that was.
I'm about right with my 5 or 6 years.
2015, I think it was, yeah.
And, and the excitement that so many countries were signing up, but
yeah,
too much signing up and not enough action.
I know.
Yeah.
Before we finish, I must ask, and you mentioned the Triennial there in passing, do you think there's anything that makes Irish Quakers unique?
I don't know. Answering that might involve being sort of critical of other yearly meetings. Or at least I'm told this, and I have gathered it from some conversations. Something like an African yearly meeting would, I think, a number of them would certainly regard yearly meetings in Europe as being too liberal. That there would be more. There would be more probably old-fashioned in their views, and they would think maybe that we were going astray a little bit. Then I have a bit of difficulty with people who are friends, but also are either a member of another Christian denomination at the same time, or are followers of Buddha at the same time. And then you start to say, well, if I say the Society of Friends is a Christian body, that's the basic for a Christian body. Is that going to offend some people? It's a tricky area. because I'm pretty sure that every meeting has its own personality, its own character. And yet, you can go to a Quaker meeting, certainly in the UK or here in Ireland. I don't have any wider experience than that. But you haven't been at that meeting before, but you encounter something that feels very familiar as well. So in the midst of difference, there can be familiarity. So I think that's why I'm finding it hard to answer.
Do you think there's a difference between somebody who finds Quakerism later in life compared to those who are born into it?
Not in every case, and that's an interesting area to think about. I've heard people who've been born as Quakers say that at some point they had to actually go through a process, something like the process that somebody goes through who is a convinced friend, that they had, in order to continue with the society, they needed to become convinced anew. They had brought up with it, but they were so used to it. And at some point in their lives, they encountered a challenge. People who come in have often thought about it very deeply. But nowadays, when one can look so much up on the internet before doing anything, I've found that people who have come amongst us are often know a great deal about Quakerism and how it all works, and are very anxious to see whether it lives up to what they've read about. So I reckon it's probably important at all stages to do a good amount of background reading, whether you're a newcomer or somebody who's been there all your life. And my goodness, there is such fantastic Quaker writing.
Next up is Tim Rouse, who is a young adult friend from Britain Yearly Meeting. I first met Tim while attending the Cuno Summer School in Geneva in 2011. He now attends Tottenham Meeting in South London.
So my dad's found Quakerism, I think maybe 5 or 10 years before I had heard of it. So he was kind of a newcomer and started taking me along when I must have been 8 or 10, thereabouts. So unlike some people, I wasn't born into Quakerism. I didn't have a family who was steeped in it, but I didn't find it by myself, which I find kind of puts me between two camps of like people who found it entirely by themselves and those who've got like generational history of Quakerism. So I kind of went along and I got a certain amount of like Sunday school. I forget what we called it, whether it was first day school at our meeting or not. And then when I was 13, my mum died of cancer. And I kind of thought, well, hang on a minute. If this has happened, then there's no loving God. And I stopped being interested in religion and Quakerism for a couple of years. And then slowly started drifting back because I was like, well, yeah, but this is a community that I like. So then someone at my local meeting told me about Junior Yearly Meeting, and I got signed up and I went along and I met a bunch of people who, unlike the average person at my local meeting, were not in their 60s, which was really nice. And I guess you could say it kind of went from there, really. I went to JOM for a few years. When I went and studied in Reading and started going to YFGM after a year or two. When I moved to London and I'd been to our yearly meeting a couple of times. As we were discussing earlier, I went to the Cuno Summer School in Geneva. And then, kind of just been involved fairly constantly since then.
So, as you were saying, the first time that we met was in Geneva on the Cuno Summer School. All these years later, what are your lasting memories from that time that we were in the city together as part of a group exploring the workings of the UN from a Quaker perspective?
What comes to mind, I think, most is kind of what we were saying earlier about that sense of forming a community out of a bunch of people from, like, what was it, 4 different continents, maybe 5, who had never met each other before, had kind of very little in common in some ways, apart from an interest in international diplomacy and this, like, and Quakerism. But then that's quite a broad thing because, you know, people coming from different continents have very different experiences of Quakerism quite often. But yeah, just forming like this group of people who were really interested in, were being bombarded with information, desperately trying to take it all in, and then going out for ice cream in the evening and kind of forming a friendship group out of quite a thin base.
I remember it being very clean as a city. I remember their public transport system was immaculate. It ran on time and there was no such thing as a delay. And if you were late, well, good luck to you.
I remember it being a very expensive city. I mean, I know what you mean about being clean, but I got a sense of being very well ordered and, like, everyone a little bit proud and correct, you know, but also very much to, like, going about their business. And I think that was this big sense I got from obviously getting to wander around inside the UN buildings and stuff. Like everyone having a purpose and being busy about their purpose.
Did you have a blank canvas going, or did you have a sense of what you wanted to find out or to learn?
I think at the time I definitely wanted a career in international diplomacy, and thought this would be a really useful way to find out lots more about it. Yeah, I don't think I would. That's certainly not what I've gone into, and it's certainly, I don't think I would want that now. But that was kind of the where I'd come from. I'd done a bit of Model UN at uni in the preceding year, and kind of found out that there's this whole world of international diplomacy. I want to say international cooperation, but that's maybe a bit rosy.
So tell me about being a young friend in BYM. Tell me about the structures and kind of what sort of clientele you have, so to speak.
So I think there's 2 parts, kind of 2 significant parts to being a young friend. There's YFGM, which is the Young Friends General Meeting, which is the national community for young adult friends aged 18 to 35. It was 18 to 30-ish for many years. Literally last week, we finally decided to synchronize with EMIF and, like, the rest of the world and start saying 18 to 35. And then there's BYM itself and the kind of experience of being a friend under the age of about 50 in a yearly meeting, which, like a lot of Quaker yearly meetings, is majority retired people. So YFGM has been probably was certainly my major, like, Quaker community from the age of, like, 19 through to 27 or thereabout. So, like, a good long period. And that is so YFGM has general meetings 3 times a year, February, May and October. And until the last year or 2 when the pandemic hit, those take place in a meeting house somewhere in Great Britain. Usually England or Scotland, because there's nowhere in Wales that's big enough for it. And we have a weekend of, like, spirituality sessions and getting to know each other and cooking and eating together and doing business. Like, it's a separate charity, so it runs all of its own, like, administrative affairs, but also, like, Quaker affairs. So adopting concerns, considering how we want to respond to things. So I remember, like, writing letters about the legalization of same-sex marriage, doing things about Trident and the renewal of our nuclear weapons system. And then more recently, we've taken a really kind of central role in the yearly meeting about calling for more inclusion of trans and gender diverse people. And I've been really involved in various different ways. I was a member of staff for YFGM for a year. I've been on a nominations committee. I was a management trustee for a few years. And then again, as of last week, I've become one of the co-clerks.
Do you find it hard to keep track of the Young Friends community? Are you all fairly spaced out?
Yeah, so YFGM covers the same area as the yearly meeting, as Britain yearly meeting. So that's England, Scotland, Wales, Man, and the Channel Islands. So basically the bits of the UK that aren't the North of Ireland. And there's probably, I'd be hard pressed to put a number on it, but there's probably a couple of hundred young friends in that geographic region, possibly upwards from that. Of those, maybe 70 or 80 have attend YFGM at any one time. And that number goes up and down over the years, like between about 50 and 80. Right now, it's really low because we've pivoted YFGM to being online because we haven't had much choice. And it's kind of like 30s or 40s at the moment. But yeah, there's definitely people, there's people I know really well through YFGM and I'm in regular contact with, like, you know, I have my weekly role-playing group that vaguely weekly. And then there's people that you see maybe once every YFGM, and then there's people that I'm just vaguely aware of that I've met at JYM or like events like years and years ago, and you might bump into occasionally. You might be vaguely aware of them on Facebook, but that's about as much as. So it's definitely I think compared to what I've seen of like EMIF and like other European young Quaker communities, it's just on a different scale.
It sounds like you're very efficient as a group.
Yes and no.
You were very hesitant there for a second. I guess with the numbers you're talking about, there probably is a need to be efficient or to keep track of numbers. Is that fair to say?
Partly. I mean, I think part of it is that's how I work, and I look at. I'm a bit of a geek for the stats and the getting a sense of the structures. YFGM tries to do a lot. Sometimes it tries to do too much, and I think one of the things we've had in the last few years there's been a bunch of burnout. People who take on roles have been finding that there's just too much to do. Like particularly our nominations committee have found that there are too many roles to appoint to, and they can't find enough people in the community to fill them, which I think is a problem a lot of Quaker organisations have. But it feels like it's one it's very much in our power. So a couple of years ago, we did a review that I was involved in that like cut the number of roles slightly, but like we still got like 50 roles to fill, and I say about 30 people to fill them. So the balance is still there. So we do get a lot done, but I think there's a thing of are we doing the right things? Are we actually getting the job done in a way that is sustainable for the people that are involved?
Is it a case where you think it's important that the discussion topics, the themes that are being discussed at YFGM are in line with the yearly meeting? Or is that something that isn't necessarily as important to the group?
I think what YFGM tends to consider is what YFGMers think is important. And that is often, but not necessarily, what the yearly meeting is thinking about. Like, you know, we're a bunch of Quakers. When the British government was talking about renewing Trident, we were going to be involved in that, and there was lots of conversation in Britain yearly meeting, but also in the wider peace movement of Quaker and non-Quaker about what to do about that. And so that fed through into YFGM, and it wasn't necessarily that we were discussing it because the yearly meeting was, but because it was something that was relevant to us as people. I think with trans and gender diversity, inclusion of gender diverse people, it's been really depressing that there's a bunch of Quaker meetings and that have hosted really transphobic groups. There's been a bunch of there's Quakers who have expressed views that are just not inclusive, and it's becoming a topic in the yearly meeting. So it would be really unfair to say that no one was talking about it before YFGM, because there are a couple of, like, North East Thames area meeting, which is the next one over from me, has been putting out good stuff for years. But when YFGM kind of took that on, it was because it was something that was hurting some of our members. It was something that we felt as a youth community was really important. And that part of our job as the young people's general meeting was to put that on the agenda of the area meeting, of the yearly meeting.
Did you find, or have you found, that the yearly meeting has been supportive of that concern, for want of a better way of putting it?
So the wheels of Quaker processes grind really, really slow. We sent a concern to Meeting for Sufferings, or we sent a minute about this to Meeting for Sufferings. We also, when we adopted our kind of statement affirming that trans rights are human rights and that people should be able to self-identify, we sent that to a friend who published it really prominently on the front page, and we got a lot of positive feedback from that. Actually, we didn't get any backlash. But it's taken a couple of years actually for that to go from being a minute that we sent to Sufferings to something that's getting discussed properly. And I don't think that's happening just because of us, although I think the YFGM's contribution to that has helped, and like it's definitely become part of the conversation around that. So yeah, like I think we're treated as a general meeting within the yearly meeting, and like that we're not listened to above all else, but we're not ignored.
So it's kind of a healthy balance almost, or just even a balance.
It's a balance. I might be being a bit optimistic about that. I might be being a bit positive because it feels like it's been a very slow process. But yeah, I think that it's a balance.
So you're talking about the Young Friends community within British Yearly Meeting. Do you get a sense of how they, or even you, feel about the future of the Yearly Meeting over there, about the structures in place, or what kind of changes you'd like to see when it comes to a point where our generation will be making decisions for the benefit of the wider Yearly Meeting or the wider group of Quakers?
Yeah, it's been interesting because it's very much felt. I remember like 5 years ago, it felt like everyone at the top table at the yearly meeting and in the structures was like my grandparents' generation. And then I think in the last 5 years, it's kind of shifted and it's now my parents' generation and the parents of the people around me. And so I think that, that's partly the process of me getting older. But like, it feels like there's been a few shifts and a few general, a slight shift in the yearly meeting towards an active awareness of the importance of having a diverse range of perspectives. That doesn't just mean age, that also means like work status, to a certain extent race, although obviously it shouldn't be obvious, but Britain Yearly Meeting is overwhelmingly white. So yeah, I think that the people making decisions has tipped slightly towards maybe middle-aged rather than elderly recently. And things like, one of the yearly meeting clerks is someone who, Irish young, is Siobhan, who was clerk of YFGM very recently. Very recently, like 5-10 years ago. And so there's a feeling that young friends, and relatively recently young friends, are part of the community and are being, again, included, not listened to as not put on a pedestal, but a part of the conversation. I think the structures are a compromise that no one would ever design them like this. And we have a lot of things where area meetings are their own charities in law, which causes a bunch of bureaucracy, a lot of people having to be charity trustees, and a lot of misunderstanding about what the role of a trustee is. There's a lot of area meetings that are just really struggling for people, kind of like I was saying with YFGM. Whether that will ever change, how that would change, I don't really know. I think we're looking at a dwindling society, dwindling from maybe having a couple of thousand vaguely active people across the country to more like 1,000 over the next decade or so. And that's going to have a profound impact unless we either do something amazing to bring in loads more people and do more outreach, or adjust our structures. And sadly, I think the latter one is more likely.
What do you get out of meeting for worship, that sort of spiritual setting on a Sunday morning?
It depends on a meeting, and it depends on my mood. Historically, I've found it really valuable as a place to, like, I don't know, gather my thoughts. Sounds very, it's not mundane, it's quite deep and spiritual, but to kind of pull threads together that you don't necessarily have time and space to pull together through the week. I just find something quite magical about being in a space where everyone is working towards the same purpose, or just like is there, choosing to be there for that reason, and with respect for one another, and kind of, yeah, you can feel the connections between people very tangibly, which I find really valuable.
Do you seek that space out during the week? Is it hard to find that space during the week when you're not necessarily in a room together with people?
I don't know. I think there've been times when I do, but not very often. Like, and I find it quite hard to do so. I've been lucky enough I've had a couple of times when I worked quite near Bunhill Fields Meeting in the city of London, or just technically just outside the city, and I've gone on a Wednesday when they do midday meeting for worship, and I also used to do that occasionally when I worked at a friend's house, and it's nice. I don't think it's quite as gathered. I don't think it's quite. I find I'm still quite immersed in, like, the busyness of life, whereas I think on a Sunday morning. On a Sunday morning, it's a 50-50 chance of either you reach a really deep spiritual connection, or I'm asleep because it's a morning and I'm trying to use my weekend for rest.
You worked in a friend's house?
Yeah, for a year. That was when I was the YFGM coordinator, that was based at a friend's house. The job was I was technically employed by BYM, working on YFGM stuff most of the time.
I have been lucky enough to visit friend's house, but for those who possibly haven't, can you describe it to me, and what kind of environment there is there, and what do you love about it?
So friend's house is this massive, beautiful, early 20th century building right opposite Euston Station in London. Literally, you'd come out of the station, there's a very busy road, and then there's this building that has massive posters on the outside talking about Quakerism, and it's where we hold Brittany Meeting most years, when it isn't, like, off on some university campus somewhere, and it's full of conference. I mean, the main thing now is it's full of conference rooms and rooms that are let out to bring in some money for society, but it's also got the central offices for Brittany Meeting. It's also got the library. And it's really not, like, it's a physically well proportioned building. It's a nice space. There's a very quiet courtyard where you wouldn't believe that the hustle and bustle of the city was just outside. It's a kind of place where, and I'm pre-pandemic obviously, where you could wander through the corridors, and because there's a cafe and there's usually events on, and you've got like a 50% chance of finding some random Quaker that you've met years ago and having a conversation with them. So yeah, it's a really nice space in that regard.
I'm just conscious that it sort of feels where Friend's House is positioned with big banners outside, that's both activism and outreach at the same time. You know, I remember when I visited that, I remember when I was there visiting, just thinking, what sort of relationship does Friend's House have with the area and the wider kind of borough of the city? Do you think it kind of stands alone, or do you get a sense that those in the area or even in the city have an idea or have a sense of what staff do in Friend's House? Or do you think it's very much just sort of a world into its own, and it just happens to be opposite a very busy train station?
I think it's a bit of both. Like, there's definitely it's a great place to study, and it's right around the corner from UCL, and like it's in the heart of the student part of London. So you definitely get a lot of students going in there to study, use a cafe, use a study space, and it's hired out by Birkbeck, which is like the adult education university, which is again around the corner. So it gets a lot of use from certainly that part of the local community, and I think that there's people come in and they have at least vaguely heard of Quakers, and they will see the posters that talk about peace and some of their activist work. I don't know necessarily how deep that is, but it is used. On another level, I think it's probably less connected to the community than a lot of Quaker meeting houses are, in that in a lot of towns and cities in the rest of the UK, I think your local Quaker meeting house is where the activist group goes to meet, and the AA group goes to meet, and the art class go to meet, because it's cheap rooms for hire. And like I've certainly like known people in activist stuff say, oh yeah, I know that Quaker meeting house because it's where the activist group meets. And I don't think you get that for Friend's House because it's a corporate venue. It's quite expensive room bookings. So on that sense, I think it is less engaged than your average meeting house probably is.
So do you feel at some point then those who are that bit further away from London feel even less connected to the work that they do in Friend's House? Like, do you think because it's so sort of self-contained in a busy section of the city that, you know, if you're living in Manchester or Birmingham or even as further afield as York, that you sort of miss out on that kind of environment? Or like, do you think, even, I guess another way of putting that, like, do you think it's important for people to understand and fully appreciate what Friend's House is there for as a kind of a nucleus of sorts?
I mean, on some levels, like there's the definite thing of it's a long way away, and it feels quite remote if you're not in London. And I mean that shows the wider pattern of the UK, I think, in that if you're not in London, you resent London. And part of Friend's House, one of the things Friend's House has done in the last, I think this year actually, has been opening up an office in one of the meeting houses in Leeds. So the deputy recording clerk is now based in Leeds. She was already living in Leeds, so it was probably easy to sell her on that. But it does mean that people are a bit closer, and it feels a bit less like it's this remote monolith in London. But as a cultural centre, and as I think the most important thing about Friend's House for Quakers is probably that it is where we do our yearly meeting, and it is where we have the main room in Friend's House is. It was refurbished a few years ago, and it used to be known as the Large Meeting Room, and it's now officially branded as the Light, which is a very controversial naming choice. But that can hold like 1,500 people. So, well, no, 1,100. So you can cram in all of the Quakers who turn up to a yearly meeting into that room and have some of the most incredible gathered worship and the most incredibly disciplined business meetings in that space. And I think if you're not part of that feels very remote. But then the people who turn up to yearly meeting have always been, they're not necessarily a London set, but they're a particular subset of like British Quakers, or the yearly meeting friends, the ones who actually turn out for yearly meeting.
And tell me what you love about the Quaker business methods. You've been active on committees over the years. What do you get out of it? What do you love about that process of reaching consensus with the group?
Oh, consensus is a controversial word.
That's why I used it. Because ultimately that is what we're trying to do, right?
Theoretically, we're trying to find the will of God.
Right.
And there's a question there because, you know, do you believe in God? Do you think that God's will can be known? Do you think there's a measurable difference between the will of God and the best possible decision that that group of people could make? And I think actually there's something really important, which is that we say we're trying to find the will of God. We don't claim that we have always found the will of God. That's why, or one of the reasons you say you hope so, that we think we've got as close as we can. We hope it's the will of God. It might not be. In terms of what you get out of business meeting, to the extent that it is about finding consensus, it's just this incredibly powerful tool where if everyone is going in good faith, then you can find senses of the meeting. You can find a resolution that might not have occurred to anyone, that isn't a compromise, but goes beyond what anyone really expected to come out of it. And it can be very authentic to the promptings of the divine that people have felt. I mean, I think the kind of ultimate bit of business that I've ever been in, probably in terms of significance at least, was the discernment around same-sex marriage in York in 2009. Again, it's 1,000 Quakers in a room or thereabouts. The expectation was that we would say, we'll try and get the law changed at some point. And what we came out of that session, following lots of ministry in different directions as well, including some very some ministry that was very opposed to same-sex marriage. We came out of that with a much more radical position than anyone was expecting going in. We came out of that saying we're just going to do marriages because that's what God says. Like the Lord says these marriages are happening, so we'll better get on with it. And that wasn't what people going in were expecting, and it wasn't what people were. It wasn't like a faction had been advocating for it. For that, it was just that was where we had been led to as a community, and it's really powerful. It's really vulnerable to abuse and exploitation, and I think it requires self-discipline and communal discipline to avoid those things. But compared to a lot of other ways of making decisions, if you've got the time to do it, I think it does work really well.
So you're almost saying it's transformative to a certain degree.
Absolutely, yeah.
On a totally separate issue, you were telling me before we started that you were involved in planning a Quaker wedding.
Yes.
Do spill the beans, because I feel like I have never been to a Quaker meeting with attention for a wedding. What is that like? What's different about it? What's unique?
It's this really cool process. So basically you have a Quaker meeting, and in the middle of it, the people who want to get married stand up and declare that they're going to marry each other. And then... As you do. Yeah, pretty much. It's ministry, but sincerely, it's ministry, and it is a meeting for worship. And on a very basic level, it is just saying there's a George Fox quote in that's repeated in Quaker Faith and Practice, and it came up a lot during the same-sex marriage stuff. Marriage is the Lord's work. We are but witnesses. And it's kind of, I really like it on a pragmatic level. It's just, this is a thing that has happened, and we're going to recognize it. We're going to celebrate it. And so the process is really simple on one level. And in practice, those meetings, because you invite the family and you invite lots of other people, and you finish by doing the other, the kind of other defining feature, which is everyone who was present at the meeting will sign the marriage certificate. So in a civil or in a Church of England service, then it's just a couple of witnesses sign it, but every single person there will sign the wedding certificate, which gives you a really great thing to hang up on the wall. But also it's about the community that were there, the community that you're in is part of the marriage, and you're saying it's between the couple and God, but it's also about offering a commitment to each other and to the meeting, and the meeting is upholding you throughout that marriage as well. So it's very much about being integrated into the community.
Are they common? Like, is that a really basic question? Are there many Quaker weddings these days?
I don't know. I know of at least 3 that are currently being planned, or like, but that's, I don't have a comprehensive.
No, it's not a. I'm not the Gestapo. I'm just curious. I don't feel like I've been to any. I've been to a couple of Quaker funerals, and they're really just more memorial services, I feel.
I quite like the Quaker. Just a brief digression on the Quaker funeral stuff. I really like the idea of us meeting for celebrating someone's life rather than actually having a funeral. And it means that you can separate out the kind of sad bit of the mourning, which is a really important part of life. But it was also, then you can have a meeting to celebrate their life, and it can be a much more uplifting, kind of a different type of grief. I just wanted to throw in one more thing about weddings, if that's cool.
Sure.
So in the UK, only Anglican, Jewish, and Quaker weddings are like binding as weddings in their own right. So they're legally recognised when they happen. Everyone else has to get a civil ceremony as well. So there's a whole bunch of bureaucracy that has to be gone through to have a Quaker wedding. But it does mean that it's then legally binding.
On a totally separate note, do you have a sense of growing out of the young friends community and just sort of morphing your way into being an adult and part of the wider society of friends?
That is a really great question. Yes, but also no. Like I've been involved in YFGM for getting on for 10 years now, 8 or 9. And that's been my major community. And it's starting to get to the point where I feel like some of the conversations are coming around again, and it's time for a new generation to be able to have those conversations. But also it's a community that I love and I don't really want to leave behind. So it's been really interesting looking at last week's YFGM. We were looking at the upper age limit and where the boundary lies for being a young adult, and whether we should call it 35, whether we should call it 30, and that kind of stuff, which led to us talking a lot about what's next. Because I'm involved in Tottenham, my local meeting, but it's not. I don't know. I love the people and I like the worship, but it's not the level of involvement that I've had in YFGM. The area meeting, again, I've not been super involved with, and I'm slowly getting more involved with. But for lots of people at my kind of age, so I'm 29 now, they aren't necessarily nearly as settled as I am. I own a house, I'm engaged. There's a level of settled there that some people will never achieve. Some people will get. Some people will have had at 20, but some people won't get for decades more. So if you don't find that, if you don't have a local meeting that you're involved with, how do you engage with Quakerism, and what does that connection to your to the wider church look like? And I don't think there's necessarily a particularly good answer to that. A lot of committees rely, and a lot of yearly meeting stuff relies on retirees because they have time and they're available during the day. And there can be quite a barrier to getting involved in things, whether it's at a yearly meeting or an area meeting or a local meeting level, if you can't just commit a huge chunk of time. A lot of people in the kind of middle generations have kids and lose time to that. You know what I mean? So I think there is that kind of sense of a big gap in Quakerism. There's an active teenage and young adult communities, and then there's retirees by the score. But there's a missing, sort of, one of my friends calls it a missing generation in the middle. that people kind of go into and then might come out at the other end, but might not.
The last name on the list for now is Lynn Finnegan. Lynn is an illustrator and an editor who is currently based at the Eco Village in Clough in County Tipperary. She delivered the public lecture at Yearly Meeting in Belfast, which is available to view online. It turns out it was a positive and uplifting experience.
I'm feeling very nourished. Yes, I felt very... it was just wonderful, wasn't it, to all be together for the first time in a few years. I think everyone was just loving being in each other's physical presence. So I did the IYM, the public lecture this year, and I felt very held by a lot of people, which was lovely. It was lovely, actually, and a lovely opportunity to think about what I wanted to say and figure out a way of saying it and feeling heard and having really lovely conversations afterwards that are continuing on. So that's lovely.
Are you conscious of moving out of the Young Friends community?
Well, I didn't grow up a Quaker. So I started going to Quakers at university when I first went to university in my first term. So I've never really felt like a young Quaker, really. I've worshipped with a lot of meetings. I've spent time in Oxford, York, Edinburgh, Geneva, South Belfast, Coleraine and Limerick. So I've lived in a lot of different places, and I've always showed up to meeting as a person rather than a young person. So maybe that does change it a bit. I'm not sure. I kind of feel in the middle. I'm definitely not young. I don't feel young in any sense of that word. And I don't feel old when I'm hanging out with Quakers either, because we're not.
So do you think then there's a big difference for those who were born into Quakerism compared to those who might find it later in life?
Do you know, I don't know, because I don't know what it feels like to have been brought up a Quaker. I definitely feel sad to have missed out on all those lovely young Quaker events and, youth clubs and all those lovely things. I feel like I really was searching. I was brought up Catholic, but my dad's family were all Presbyterian and my mum's family were all Catholic. So we were almost, growing up in the 90s in the north, sort of kind of the other. Catholics thought we were Protestant and Protestants thought we were Catholic, So I knew as a teenager, I had a very clear sense that if religion isn't answering that question of how do we solve conflict and how do we live at peace with each other, then I don't really have any time for religion if it can't answer that question. And then I came across Quaker and was like, oh, I knew it. I knew that there was an answer and that theology does speak to this. And I remember my first meeting really clearly. I'll never forget it. I just felt like I'd come home and I felt such gratitude at finding a spiritual community that I felt I belonged to.
So I'm right in saying that you grew up in the north?
So I grew up on the north coast. So I grew up in Coleraine would be my closest meeting. So we were a bit sheltered. We were very much more sheltered than if I had grown up in Belfast, for sure, in terms of the troubles. But there was that underlying sense of everyone knew who was which, that was the mood of the 90s, I'd say, up on the north coast. Yeah.
And how was Coleraine Meeting growing up? Were they quite welcoming?
Oh my goodness, so welcoming. It could not have been more welcoming. It's a small meeting, Coleraine, and with just absolutely gorgeous people. And it's the meeting I've gone back to again and again because it's where my parents still are. And it's just wonderful. I love it. It's a very special thing to have a small group of people that you worship with over a long period of time, and you feel comforted by them and accountable to them as well. If in a spiritual sense, I find that really, really special and really important.
Are you conscious of just how much being involved with friends, calling yourself a Quaker, how much that impacts on your day-to-day life outside of the society?
I was talking about this to my husband recently, actually, to Andrew. And I was like, oh, I think Quakers has really influenced like basically everything I do. And he just laughed at me. He was like, well, of course it does, Lynn. It's not like you just show up on a Sunday. He's like, isn't that the whole point? I was like, oh yeah, of course it is. And it is, you can't, of course you don't just show up on a Sunday. It gets into everything. whether you want it to or not. It gets into, I feel it's influenced what I want to get involved in and what I want to commit my time to, and how you start seeing the world, I think. Or just, I think it gets to the point where you can't not do something. So I am now an illustrator and an editor, and almost all of my projects are related to sustainability and non-violence and peace building. And I think I've been really lucky to work with lots of NGOs involved in those issues, and that there's lots of work out there, right? So it's I'm sort of in a very lucky space where there's lots of work to do, and I don't have to question it. I don't have to pick between work and my integrity. So I think I'm very fortunate in that sense.
Would you call yourself an activist?
Would I call myself an activist? That is a very good question, Hugh. I don't know. You've caught me off guard there. Would I call myself an activist? I do not feel very at home protesting. I think I find that hard with my personality. I'm quite quiet. I'm quite an introvert. I have a lot of admiration for people who do. So I guess I feel guilty using the word activist, because I think maybe some of my friends that spend a lot of time in the front lines might say, no, Lynn, you're quieter than that. But then again, it's, everything that I do is trying to work for a little bit more of a peaceful world. So who knows? Depends how you define activist, Hugh. I should have said that first. Define activist.
I guess I would define an activist as somebody who tries to make positive changes in the world. I don't know if it's just me, but I find the activist space can be quite noisy. I think successful or positive or effective activism is much more effective when the messages are quite succinct and to the point. I don't know if does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that often we fall into a very narrow definition of activism to mean that you have to be out on the streets. And I don't think that that's true. I think there's so many different ways that we're called to show up to this. Yeah, and it's, we need people that are working in the system, changing the system. We really need people outside the system shouting into the system, telling it that it needs to change. And we need everybody in between. And we need the farmers out in the fields and the lawyers in the courtrooms and the engineers and the teachers and the leaders and the healers. We need everybody.
So how has the move been to Cloughjordan in Tip? Was there anything that surprised you having made the move?
Yeah, so Cloughjordan Eco Village is a hugely ambitious project that was founded more than 20 years ago now. They bought the land about 20 years ago, and it's 70 hectares, which is really big. And it's got a community farm and lots of different things. So Eco Village is quite a broad umbrella term. There's a global eco village network with lots of different eco villages around the world, and they all look very different. So Cloughjordan in Tipperary is absolutely gorgeous. I love it. And it has the full spectrum of humanity in it. It's got all the variations of eco people that you can imagine. And I find that really, really gorgeous to live with and among these people. I'll tell you one thing I've been surprised at, how little ego there is, really, in general. You don't get very much self-righteousness here, which I love. I would have found that very difficult if there was. There's a lot of, sure, we tried this and it didn't work, and then we tried this and it didn't work, and then we tried this, which I wouldn't recommend to anybody, and then we did this. But a real recognition that Cloughjordan is a group of people trying to be pioneers, for people to come behind them and succeed faster in what they're trying to achieve to create a sustainable society.
And is there a big age range of those who live there amongst the community?
There is. I'd say, yes, lovely spread, intergenerational spread. The age group that's missing are people in their 30s because of the price of buying a site and building a house. And that's definitely a limitation that everyone's very aware of and are working hard to overcome.
And has it been hard to adapt not having a Quaker meeting close by?
So Limerick is my closest meeting now from Clerk, and it's 50 minutes away. And I find that difficult. I definitely want to be closer to a Quaker meeting. And then, of course, COVID happened just after we moved. So I've done a lot of online meetings for worship in the past 2.5 years. And I resisted them at the start, as I think a lot of us did. We thought, oh no, it's not going to be the same. And of course it's not the same, but it's definitely better than nothing.
Just for the benefit for those who weren't there or possibly have missed it, can you give me a brief outline overview of what the actual lecture itself was about?
When you're asked to do the public lecture, you can speak about whatever you want to speak about, and you've got a year to think about it. So it is quite a unique opportunity to really think and sit and pray about what you want to say and figure out a way of saying it. And what I really wanted to talk about was, what is it that Quakers and us in Ireland, as the Quaker faith community in Ireland, what can we bring to the sustainability movement? But it's a very interesting question to ask, I thought. And as you mentioned earlier, can be a very noisy space, the environmental movement. And I think one of the things there's lots of things that we can bring. And one of the things as Quakers is our what value we place on listening and deeply listening to everybody, because we believe that there's that of God in everybody. And also to be very aware if there's ever any dehumanizing of people involved in the conversation on whatever side. That we can really bring that, and it's really bring Quaker testimonies, showing up with all the Quaker testimonies and refusing to let go of them when we show up in the space of the sustainability and eco-justice movement, and just seeing what happens. So that was, I think, I'd say that was the sense of the talk.
Would you be optimistic about the future going forward?
Yeesh. Well, I became a mother 2.5 years ago, and it does change things quite a lot to have these little humans and watching them learn the world, and knowing that I can't protect them from everything. So how do I feel? I don't know, you couldn't ask a bigger question, could you, Hugh? How do I feel about the future going forward? I think there are scary times ahead. But I don't think we're the first generation to think that or to experience that. And I do think that the Quaker testimonies are the things that are going to get us through. Yeah, it's the small things, isn't it? It's the faith and the contentment, to be content with our story within the bigger picture. To find contentment in what we can offer to the greater movement.
And how was your experience of CUNO? I'm right in saying that you were there for a couple of years.
So at CUNO, I worked for CUNO for 3 years, and we were doing, it was wonderful at the time. There was lots of intersecting programs that were getting more and more interrelated and intermeshed. And one of the most important programs we did at the time that I was there, so this was 10 years ago now, was working on natural resources, conflict and cooperation. So we were looking at the links between environmental issues and peace issues. And we were really showing up to United Nations meetings on this, looking at environment through the lens of peace and conflict. And that field has very much grown much larger in the past 10 years. You cannot look at these issues separately. You have to start in them together. You can't we have to break free of our silos, if to have any sort of positive impact on the world. I was involved in 4 of the CUNO summer schools, and they were such a highlight of the year, these 25 young people coming together from all around the world, and the energy and commitment that they brought to CUNO for those 2 weeks. And speakers used to absolutely love coming to the CUNO summer school to do talks, because they often said, these are the best questions we get asked all year from the CUNO summer schoolers. Really spot on questions about what we should be doing in the world and what is possible. So during my time at Kuno, I went to the Kenya World Gathering. So that was in 2012. And that was absolutely wonderful to be together with friends from all around the world. I'd never experienced anything like it. And I'll always remember that feeling of sitting in meeting for worship in that big plenary room that we had with Quakers from all around the world. It was absolutely amazing. I'd love to do that again, to be sharing company with Quakers from everywhere.
Did you find when you were in Kenya that there was something quite unique about us as a collective group of Irish friends that were there?
Well, it's hard to answer that objectively, Hugh, because I'd come from Ireland. I've grown up in Ireland, but I left when I was 18 and I stayed, I travelled and lived in different places for 7 years before I came home, and going to Quaker meetings and loving those Quaker meetings. So I turned up in Kenya and suddenly seeing these Irish friends, these Irish Quakers, and being like, oh my goodness, these are Irish Quakers. Who are they? What is their theology? What's going on? And it was lovely to learn. So it's impossible for me to answer that question objectively, because I was learning about Irish friends, knowing that I wanted to go home eventually, that I wanted to move back to Ireland, and I was feeling called home. I'd run around Lake Geneva listening to Irish trad music and like feeling very homesick and very sorry for myself, even though I absolutely loved Geneva, but I knew that I wouldn't be there forever.
I presume you'd hope to pass it on, right?
I mean, I'm going to try, Hugh. That's all that we can do, isn't it? We'll see how that goes. Yeah.
Isn't it nice to know, though, that the themes around friends, wherever you are in the world, are universal?
Yeah, it's really lovely. And I, pre-COVID, anyway, I did a lot of travel for my work with the United Nations, and I'd always look up if there was a Quaker meeting where I was. So I've been to Quaker meetings in fantastic places, in Kigali, in Rwanda, and in New York, in Manhattan. I went to a lovely Quaker meeting there. I just sneak off from work, go to a Quaker meeting and come back and not tell anybody. It'd be great.
Do you think your life would be very different had you not found friends?
Oh, I shudder to think. I don't know. I don't want to think about that. It would certainly be very different. There'd be a big hole. I'd still be searching. I'd still be seeking. And yeah. Oh no, that's a horrible thought. And I say these things, and it comes from deep gratitude that I found Quakers. But of course, there are other wonderful faith communities out there, and yeah, who knows? Maybe I would have found. I don't know. It's a mystery. I'm glad that I found Quakers. For me, it works for me. There's a future. We can do it. I think there's definitely this worry that we're an aging population, but I don't know. I just have this feeling that more young people are going to join in the future because we just has to happen, doesn't it? And the good thing is, you don't ever join Quakers for the peer pressure. The people that come in through the doors are like really want to be there.
And just finally, have you ever thought much about the future of the society in Ireland and how that might look in the years ahead?
Yeah, I'm not clear about it. So this is an interesting topic, and I would really love to talk about it. And actually, maybe young friends, maybe this is something we could do. We could talk about it, because I feel like this theological spectrum that is within Ireland Jury Meeting, in terms of evangelism and maybe more liberal, and I know there's lots more nuances in there, but I feel like our approaches to it is that we just don't talk about it, which isn't great. Like, we're Quakers, come on, we can do better than that. We could have really thoughtful, facilitated conversations about it, which I think would be a great idea, and which is why I'm saying I don't think a glib one-off answer is helpful to that conversation. If it's something that we have gotten into the habit of just not talking about, it would take real thought to talk, because there are real evangelical friends in Ireland, and there's friends who are very uncomfortable with evangelism, and that's great. We should embrace those differences and find a way of talking about it, not with the aim of agreeing or converting each other to one way, but to understand each other better.
And that's it for another episode of the Friendly Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you like what you've heard, don't forget you can subscribe to our social channels, and if you'd like to find out more about Quakers in Ireland, you'll find us online at quakers.ie.